Marriage in the Viking world gets sold as alliances and honor. Almost nobody talks about the darker mechanisms behind the bride price inflation that pushed young men to raid, the concubine system that elite men used as power displays, or what happened to the women taken as slaves and forced into sexual service when a chieftain married his daughter to seal an alliance, when a jarl took a frilla as his concubine, when raiders carried off women from Houth in 821. Which parts are documented facts? Which parts reveal a system built on controlling women's bodies as resources? And what does the archaeology actually show? The year is 922 on the Volga River. Ahmad ibn Fadlan watches the Rus prepare a funeral. The dead chieftain needs a companion for the afterlife. They ask the slave women. One volunteers. She's 15 years old. For 10 days, she drinks, sings, and becomes the bride of a dead man. She's dressed in fine clothes, given authority over other slaves, fed the best food. Then the men take turns with her, 6, 7, maybe more. On the day of the burning, she's lifted onto the ship. An old woman they call the Angel of Death waits. The girl tries to enter the tent but can't move forward. The woman seizes her head and forces her inside. 2 men hold her feet, 2 more hold her hands. The Angel of Death wraps a cord around her neck while 2 men pull it tight in opposite directions. Then the dagger. Not once. Multiple stabs, here and there. The men outside beat shields to cover any screams so other slave women won't be discouraged from volunteering. The ship burns. The Rus man laughs at Ibn Fadlan's horror. Your people bury them in the ground where worms eat them. We send them to paradise in an hour. This account from 922 is the most detailed eyewitness description of Viking ritual we have. If you value documented history that doesn't sanitize the past, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Ben Raffield's 2017 study in Viking in medieval Scandinavia, published by Breppels, which examines polygyny and concubinage using evolutionary theory and anthropological data, and Ahmad ibn Fadlan's Risala from 922, the earliest eyewitness account of Rus funeral practices, translated and analyzed by James Montgomery in 2015. Now back to the information. Marriage in the Viking Age wasn't about love, it was currency. Political alliances needed sealing. Blood feuds needed ending. Land needed consolidating. The woman was the transaction. Her father and the groom's family negotiated 3 payments. The munder, bride price to her father. In Norway, the minimum was 12 ounces of silver. In Iceland, 8. The hymenfylgia, the dowry from her family to the new couple. And the morgengifu, the morning gift from husband to wife after consummation. This last one she kept even in divorce. The system looks protective on paper. Archaeological evidence from female graves shows jewelry, weaving tools, keys symbolizing household authority. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway from the 9th century held a woman of high status buried with incredible wealth. Carved wooden objects, textiles, a full ship. Women could divorce, women could own property. Compared to other European societies of the same period, Viking women had more rights. But rights on paper and lived reality split when you examine who controlled the system and why. The bride price created a problem. Nature maintains roughly equal numbers of men and women, but early Viking Age Scandinavia shows fewer female graves than expected. Studies by archaeologist Neil Price in 2017 found this imbalance. 2 forces disrupted the gender balance. High-status males practicing polygyny took multiple wives, and there simply weren't enough marriageable women of desirable status. This scarcity drove bride prices through the ceiling. A young man might know exactly which girl he wanted to marry, but couldn't afford the 8 ounces of silver minimum. 11th century historian Dudo of Saint-Quentin observed that rich and powerful Viking men had many wives and concubines. These polygynous relationships created a shortage of available women for average Viking males. The average man faced a choice: stay unmarried, or get wealth and power by any means necessary. Raiding offered the fastest path. The Annals of Ulster record that in 821 Dundaus, Vikings plundered Houth near Dublin. They carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not people, women specifically. In 844, they raided Seville in Spain. Again, women and children were primary targets. The taking of women wasn't random violence, it was economic strategy. Historical sources from across the Viking Age show this pattern. Arab chronicler Ibn Miskawayh in the 10th century described the same focus. Scholars estimate that by 950, 15% of the population of Western Europe were slaves. The Viking trade network stretched from Scandinavia to Africa, from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire. Dublin and Hedeby became major slave trading hubs. Archaeological evidence from these sites includes iron collars and shackles found near harbors. Some argue these could have restrained animals, but their design matches human restraints used throughout history from antiquity forward. Their concentration in urban trading centers rather than rural farms supports their use on people. A woman taken in a raid on the Irish coast faced multiple possible fates. Immediate ransom if she had high status and a family who could pay, sale at a slave market in Dublin, Hedeby, or Birka. Transport along the Volga trade route to Arab markets where Norse traders sold slaves for silver dirhams, or kept as a thrall in a Norse household. The word thrall gives us the English thrall, meaning to be in someone's power. 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote that Vikings treated their female slaves as sex slaves. When a slave died, he added, they leave him there as food for dogs and birds. The bodies of presumed slaves found in graves across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark show signs of abuse. Stockholm University researcher Anna Kjellström examined these remains in 2019. Decapitation, trauma. These weren't people who died peacefully. Some slaves were sacrificed when masters died. They ate worse than free people. Isotope analysis by University of Oslo. Archaeologist Elise Naumann showed slaves consumed primarily fish while masters ate meat and dairy. The Frilla system formalized sexual exploitation of lower status women. A Frilla was a concubine with certain statutory rights, but far less security than a wife. Usually she was a slave or woman of inferior status, living with a wealthy man who also had a wife. The wife had authority over the Frilla if they lived in the same household. Through her relationship to a high-status man, a Frilla and her family could advance socially. Her position remained less secure than a wife's position. Children born to a Frilla had limited inheritance rights compared to children born in wedlock. Both had some right to inherit from their father, but the legitimate children received more. King Harold Fairhair provides documentation. Harold's saga hints Harfagra from the 13th century, but based on earlier sources, states simply Harald Konungur ati Margar Konur. King Harold had many wives. Then it names 3. It specifies that one marriage required that han letida af new konum sinum, that he put away 9 of his wives. A skaldic verse lists the various districts of Norway these women came from. Adam of Bremen, writing around 1070, recorded similar practices in Sweden. Quisque secundum facultatem suarum virium duas aut tres et amplius simul habet, divit et principes absque numero. According to his means, a man has 2 or 3 or more wives at one time. Rich men and princes an unlimited number. The sagas record this repeatedly. Multiple sources written by different authors at different times in varying cultural contexts. When viewed collectively, they confirm polygyny and concubinage as real social behaviors. But anthropological studies of polygynous societies reveal consistent patterns. These practices legitimize behaviors that reinforce male power. Competition among men intensifies, female seclusion increases. Women get bartered in marriage contracts. Inside households, risks rise. Domestic violence, neglect of children, male domination of decisions. The bartering of women in marriage appears clearly in saga accounts. Bandamana Saga. Chapter 9 records Gellir, stating none of his daughters were married because no man rich or accomplished enough had presented himself. The need to obtain wealth for bride price payments may have partially driven initial Viking raids. Barrett in 2008, Sinbeck in 2011, and Raffield in 2017 all note this possibility. The practice of elite men taking women from subordinate families appears in multiple sagas. In Havardar Saga, Isferding's Chapter 1, a chieftain named Thorbjorn took the daughters and female relatives of other men, keeping them for a while before sending them home. Similar behavior by a Hebridean Viking is recorded in Flomana Saga, Chapter 15. By Earl Hakon in Hakonar Saga, Chapter 45, Jenny Jokins, writing in Scandinavian Studies in 1991, notes that in all 3 cases, the chieftains were perceived to be abusing their authority. In Flomana Saga, the women's families dared not intervene. Power protected these men from consequences. Some families may have offered daughters as concubines, hoping for social advancement. The stratified nature of Viking society made polygyny and concubinage among elites more pronounced. The relationship between male power and the ability to obtain multiple wives and concubines strengthens with social stratification. These practices reached their peak in early states and empires. China, Aztec Mexico, Pharaonic Egypt. Scholar Laura Betzig documented this in 1995. Increasing social stratification in Scandinavia during the late Iron Age likely intensified both polygyny and concubinage among the aristocracy. DNA evidence supports the scale of this system. Studies of Iceland's founding population found that up to 2/3 of Iceland's female founding population had Gaelic origins from Ireland or Scotland. Only 1/3 had Nordic roots. The reverse was true for males. This suggests Nordic men in Iceland had children with women likely taken in raids from the British Isles. The most likely explanation combines voluntary Celtic migration with Celtic women taken as slaves. Sexual slavery played a significant role in Iceland's settlement. At a Swedish site called Sanda, researchers in the 1990s found a great hall surrounded by small houses. Some archaeologists now believe this was a Viking plantation with slaves as the labor force. What you likely have is slave-driven production of textiles. Textile production was women's work. Archaeological finds show production of textiles was reserved for women, while metalwork and carpentry were undertaken by men. Complex textile techniques indicate certain women specialized. They may have participated in this trade for their families, or they may have had no choice. The legal standing of married free women versus slave women and concubines created a hierarchy. A married free woman could divorce if her husband settled in a new country on his travels, but neglected to go to bed with her for 3 years. She could divorce for abuse, neglect, or loss of wealth. She called witnesses to her home and marriage bed and declared the divorce before them. The man had to return her dowry. Jarl women with property and means had real options. Carl women, free but without significant property, theoretically could leave but often lacked means to support themselves. Thrall women had no legal rights whatsoever. Norwegian legal language used neuter gender for slaves, masculine gender for free people. Slaves were seen as cattle. Advanced domestic animals living in the darkest end of the longhouse with other animals. If slaves didn't behave, they were beaten. An owner could punish slaves as much as he wanted. The slaves' bodies were available for sexual exploitation. That's not interpretation. That's documented in the legal codes and written sources. A 14th century poem, likely dating from the end of the Viking era, lists appropriate names for thrall children. The sons: Noisy, Bireboy, Stout, Sticky, Bedmate, Bad Breath, Stumpy, Fatty, Sluggish, Grizzled, Stupor. Longlegs. The daughters: Stumpina, Dumpy, Bulging Calves, Bellows Nose, Shouty, Bondwoman, Great Gossip, Raggedy Hips, Craneshanks. All pejoratives. Several imply ill health and lack of hygiene. One clearly refers to sexual servitude. Bedmate. The poem is called Rigstula. It describes how the god Rig visits 3 households and fathers children who become the 3 classes: thralls, farmers, elites. The enslaved class origins get described with deliberately degrading names. This reflects how Viking society viewed these people, not as individuals, as categories beneath consideration. When high-status women were given in political marriages, the documentation shows they often had some say in negotiations, but say and choice differ. Norwegian sagas record that fathers usually consulted daughters before arranging marriages. The Laxdæla saga mentions dowries as crucial in arranging marriages and settling disputes. According to the sagas, it normally ended in divorce or by the death of her husband if a woman was forced into a marriage. This suggests social disapproval of completely forced matches. But consider the framing. The consequence of forcing a woman into unwanted marriage wasn't she gets to say no and nothing happens. It was divorce, social disruption, or a dead husband. The system acknowledged forced matches were bad, not because women's autonomy mattered as a principle, because forced matches created instability and potential violence. Gormflaith of Leinster provides a case study. Born around 960, daughter of King Murshad of Leinster, married 3 times to members of 3 of the most powerful ruling families of Ireland. 2 husbands would be regarded as high kings. In the 970s, at a very young age, she married Olaf Quarren, ruler of Dublin. She bore a son, Sitrick, who became ruler of Dublin around 995, with support from Gormflaith's brother. The alliance forged by her marriage continued until 1014. She later married Brian Boru, High King, in the 980s, when Brian as King of Munster tried to expand influence in Leinster. That marriage produced a son, Donchad. After Brian's death at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, his son with Gormflaith succeeded him as King of Munster. Then she married Mael Secnail of Meath, who claimed both the High Kingship and Gormflaith herself. Post-Viking Age sources give her a key role in instigating the Battle of Clontarf by shaming her brother into war. 3 marriages, 3 of the most powerful families, each marriage a political calculation. Whether Gormflaith had any choice in these arrangements, the sources don't clearly state. What they show is a woman whose body and fertility were used repeatedly to forge and maintain political power. Alfgifu of Northampton belonged to a powerful Mercian noble family. Her father, Alfhelm, was Ealdorman of southern Northumbria. He came into conflict with King Athelred the Unready and was killed on the king's orders in 1006. The family sided with Sven Forkbeard during the Danish invasion of 1013. Alfgifu was married to Sven's son Canute to seal the alliance, a political reward and guarantee. In 1014, after Sven Forkbeard's death, Alfgifu and her newborn son Sven fled to Denmark. There she gave birth to a second son, Harold. In 1016, Canute returned to England and was accepted as king. He cemented his power by marrying Athelred's widow, Emma of Normandy. Canute did not seem to have repudiated his marriage to Alfgifu, but a plural marriage would not have been acceptable to the Anglo-Saxon church establishment. What this situation meant for Alfgifu remains unclear in sources. She bore Canute's sons. She was politically useful. But when he needed to consolidate power in England, another marriage took priority. She got pushed aside or maintained in some kind of secondary status. Either way, her usefulness was transactional. The system of political marriages among elites depended on maintaining enough eligible high-status women to trade. But polygamy and concubinage meant elite men took multiple partners. Harold's saga Sigurdarsnar. Chapter 33 mentions King Harold taking additional wives. The effect cascaded downward. Fewer available women overall, higher bride prices. Young men who couldn't afford marriage turned to raiding to get the wealth needed for bride price and mourning gift. They raided for portable wealth, silver, goods, and women. Women as slaves to sell or keep. Women to become concubines. The system fed itself. Need for women drove raids. Raids produced captive women. Some captive women became concubines. Some became slaves, further limiting the number of free women available for marriage among common men. The cycle continued. If you value this kind of deep research that follows the actual sources, subscribe. Also, this research is drawn from archaeological studies published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 2017 by Charlotte Hedenstierna Jansson's team at Uppsala University. From historical analyses of captivity and slavery by Ben Raffield, published in Slavery and Abolition in April of 2019, and from the Annals of Ulster, compiled in the 15th century using earlier sources that provide year-by-year documentation of Viking raids in Ireland from 431 to 1540. Back to the facts. The difference between a high-born woman given in a political marriage and a woman taken as a thrall splits along lines of legal protection and social status. But both categories involved women being moved between men's households to serve men's interests. The high-born woman brought a dowry, had legal rights, could initiate divorce, could own property. These protections mattered. Archaeological evidence shows wealthy women buried with symbols of authority, keys from female graves. Though only in about 5% of women's graves, according to analysis by the National Museum of Denmark, symbolized household management authority. But even these women rarely chose their own marriages. Even these women became political tools. The existence of women who wielded significant power doesn't negate the systematic use of women as political and economic resources. Aud, the deep-minded, after her husband's death, took control of her household and led a settlement expedition to Iceland. She distributed land to followers. She established a thriving community. But she was exceptional. The sources preserve her name because she was unusual. The Oseberg burial shows at least one woman, possibly a queen, commanded enormous resources and respect. She was buried with a ship. With carved wooden objects of incredible craftsmanship, with all the trappings of power, that burial dates to the 9th century. It's one grave. Against this single example stand thousands of graves of ordinary women whose lives left barely a trace. And beyond those, the uncounted thrall women who got no burial at all or were thrown in pits after being sacrificed at their masters' funerals. The archaeological evidence of Viking slavery remains sparse because enslaved people typically owned nothing, inherited nothing, left nothing. They weren't buried with grave goods. When they were buried at all, they went into unmarked graves or mass graves. The Sigtuna mass grave in Sweden excavated by the Sigtuna Museum contained remains of at least 19 individuals. Radiocarbon dating placed them between 880 and 1000 CE with 95.4% probability. 13 men, 5 women, 1 child. Ages ranged from approximately 7 to 55 years. At least 11 of the skeletons displayed perimortal sharp force trauma from bladed weapons. Unhealed fractures, showing the gross characteristics of perimortem sharp force trauma. The observation of many sharp violence injuries indicates the group was unarmed without possibility to actively defend themselves. The individuals may have been farmers or other civilians killed in an attack. Their bodies were thrown together in a shallow grave, measuring 4 by 2.5 by 0.3 meters. No ceremony, no grave goods. Genetic analysis by scientists publishing in the Journal of Forensic Science International Genetics in 2019 found 15 unique and 3 shared mitochondrial DNA profiles. Combined with archaeological data, they concluded a minimum of 20 individuals was buried in the mass grave. This is what violence looked like. This is what happens when sources say raiders carried off captives. Some of those captives who fought back or tried to escape ended up in pits like this one. The life of a female thrall combined multiple forms of exploitation. Sexual availability to the master and possibly to other free men in the household. Domestic labor, textile production, childcare, cooking, the grinding labor of medieval household maintenance. No rest, no refusal, no recourse. If a master decided to sacrifice a thrall at a funeral, as documented in Ibn Fadlan's account, the thrall had no choice. The account says the 15-year-old volunteer for the funeral, but Ibn Fadlan notes that once someone said "I will," they were forced to do so, and no backing out was possible. Even if he wished to, he would not be allowed. The volunteering was performance. The choice was illusory. Those who are willing are mostly the slave women, mostly, because slave women had the least power to refuse. The sexual servitude during the 10 days before the funeral wasn't described as willing. It was described as something done to her. Every day the doomed woman drank and sang as though in anticipation of a joyous event, but the old women took care of her, washing her feet with their own hands, keeping her under watch. Then 6 men entered the tent with her and cohabitated with her. Then the men came with shields and sticks and lifted her onto the ship. She was given intoxicating drink. She sang while the interpreter said she bade farewell to her girl companions. She wanted to enter the tent but put her head between it and the boat. The old woman seized her head and made her enter. The men began to strike shields with sticks so her cries could not be heard and the other slave girls would not seek to escape death with their masters. Read that sequence again. She couldn't enter the tent on her own. It had to be forced. Men beat shields to cover the sound, to prevent other slaves from being discouraged. This wasn't willing sacrifice. This was ritualized murder with a veneer of choice. Ibn Fadlan was shocked. The Rus man who spoke to him afterward thought the Arab customs were stupid. You bury people in the ground. We send them to paradise in an hour. Different moral framework. To the Rus, the slave's life mattered less than the proper ritual sending off of the master. The slave existed to serve in life and death. That's not interpretation. That's what the source describes. The distribution of power in Viking society created different experiences for different categories of women. Elite women in political marriages had more protections and options than slave women, but all women existed within a system that treated female fertility and labor as resources to be controlled and allocated by men. The bride price system created economic pressure that drove raiding. Raiding brought captive women into Scandinavian and Norse settlements. These captive women became slaves or concubines, which further reduced the available pool of free women, which drove bride prices higher, which increased pressure on young men to raid. The system was self-reinforcing. At its foundation was a simple calculation. Women had value. As wives bringing alliances and dowries, as concubines displaying status, as slaves providing labor and sexual services, as commodities and trade networks stretching from Scandinavia to Baghdad. When sources describe Vikings carrying off a great number of women from Howth in 821, from Seville in 844, from locations across Western Europe throughout the Viking Age, they're describing systematic economic activity, not random violence. Planned extraction of valuable resources. The Annals of St. Bertin record similar raids in Frankish territories. Continental sources describe captives being held within fortified raiding bases. In 882, the Annals of Fulda record a Viking force at Asselt taking captive a number of people who had entered their camp to trade. The Vikings used deception to acquire captives. They offered ransom for some. They sold others. They kept others as slaves. The entire operation was economically rational from the raiders' perspective, from the captives' perspective. It was terror. The attempt to create a more balanced historical picture by emphasizing women's rights in Viking society is understandable. Compared to many contemporary European societies, Viking women did have more legal protections. They could own property, initiate divorce, manage households. These facts matter. They complicate the narrative, but they don't erase the systematic exploitation of women with less power. A freeborn woman of the Jarl class had options. A Carl woman had fewer options. A thrall woman had none. The existence of rights for some women doesn't negate the absence of rights for others. The sources are clear about hierarchy. The law codes specify different treatment for different classes. The sagas preserve accounts of elite women wielding influence while also describing thrall women as property. The archaeological record supports this stratification. The Oseberg ship burial shows extreme wealth concentrated in one woman's grave. 9th century, Norway. A woman, possibly a queen, buried with ship, carved furniture, textiles, elaborate grave goods. That burial exists. It's real. It demonstrates that at least some women commanded significant resources, but the Sigtuna mass grave also exists. 20 people with sharp force trauma thrown into a shallow pit. No grave goods, no ceremony. Both are part of the archaeological record. Both describe Viking Age reality. The picture isn't simple, it isn't uniform, it's stratified by class, by status, by circumstances, by the particular practices of specific regions and time periods across nearly 3 centuries. What emerges from the sources is a society where women's value derived primarily from their usefulness to male family members in the political and economic structures those men maintained. High-status women could leverage their positions, could negotiate, could sometimes choose or refuse matches, could divorce if treated badly, could own and manage property, could act as regents, could influence politics through relationships, but these capabilities existed within constraints. A woman's reputation and place in society were connected to her husband. The sagas describe women competing over who has the best husband. Young girls knew what to look for in a prospective husband. Not because romantic love was irrelevant, love appears in Norse sources. The concept of matki munner, the mighty passion, recurs in sagas and poetry. Stories exist of love developing within arranged marriages, but the institutional framework was political and economic first. Emotional attachment was secondary or emerged after the fact. For women lower in the social hierarchy, constraints tightened. A Carl woman without significant property might have the legal right to divorce, but lack practical means to exercise it. A thrall woman had no rights at all. She was property. Her children were property. If she had children by her master, those children had some inheritance rights, but remained stigmatized. The master could free a thrall, could marry a former thrall, could elevate a frilla. These possibilities existed. They appear in sources. But they depended entirely on the master's choice. The thrall had no power to demand freedom or better treatment. She could try to be useful, could try to please, could hope for mercy, but she couldn't demand. The sexual exploitation appears throughout sources. Ahmad ibn Fadlan's account is explicit. Vikings treated their female chattel as sex slaves. The Rus ruler is said to have 40 concubines. The wooden idols to which they made offerings also had slave women to serve their sexual needs in the Rus religious framework. William Fitzhugh at the Smithsonian Institution stated that female slaves were concubines, cooks, and domestic workers. All 3 roles simultaneously. The work never stopped. The availability to the master never stopped. There was no sphere of privacy or autonomy. A thrall woman existed to serve. When she stopped being useful, or when ritual demanded, she could be killed. The skeletal remains from graves in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark show signs of abuse and decapitation. These were people who died violently, who lived hard lives, whose bodies show the evidence of their treatment. DNA analysis reveals migration patterns that support the written sources. Iceland's female founding population, 2/3 Celtic, 1/3 Nordic, male founding population reversed. This genetic signature matches what the annals of Ulster describe. Raids targeting women, women carried into captivity, women transported to settlements, women bearing children to Norse men, whether through marriage, concubinage, or rape. The result appears in the genetic record 1,000 years later. The women of Ireland and Scotland ended up in Iceland, not primarily because they chose to go, because they were taken. The system of political marriages among elites and the system of slavery fed from the same logic. Women as resources to be moved between households to serve male interests. The difference was legal status and the presence or absence of consent, but the underlying framework treated female fertility, female labor, and female bodies as things to be controlled and allocated. High-status women participated in this system as beneficiaries when it worked for them, and as victims when it didn't. Gormflaith married 3 times to 3 of the most powerful men in Ireland. Her marriages produced sons who became kings. She wielded influence. Post-Viking Age sources give her credit or blame for instigating the Battle of Clontarf, but she was married at a very young age the first time. Her marriages served her family's political interests. Whether she gained power through these marriages, or was used as a tool to create alliances, the sources don't clearly distinguish. Probably both were true to varying degrees at different times. The comparison to other medieval European societies provides important context. In many parts of medieval Europe, women had even fewer rights, were seen completely as property, had no legal recourse, couldn't own property, couldn't initiate divorce. Viking women's legal rights were genuinely more expansive than those of many contemporary women elsewhere. This matters. It complicates any simple narrative of universal oppression. But it doesn't mean Viking society was egalitarian or that women had equality. It means the specific forms of patriarchy differed. Some women in some circumstances could exercise some power. but the overall system was structured and controlled by men for male benefit. The evidence of women buried with weapons reopens questions about Viking gender roles. The Birka grave, BJ 581 excavated in the 1870s, contained a skeleton assumed to be male because of the weapons: shield, knife, bow and arrow, spear, axe, sword. A complete gaming set with dice and playing pieces often associated with military commanders. In the 1970s, osteological analysis suggested the skeleton was female. In 2016, Anna Kellström at Stockholm University confirmed it. In 2017, Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson's team at Uppsala University extracted DNA, 2 X chromosomes, no Y chromosomes. The skeleton was female. The weapons showed signs of use by a trained warrior, not ceremonial. The grave was marked by a large granite stone 8 feet wide, indicating importance. The grave was in a prominent location directly beside the garrison at Birka. The findings sparked enormous controversy. Critics questioned whether the right bones were tested, whether there might have been a male body that went missing, whether the person might have been transgender. In 2019, Hedenstierna Jansson's team published a follow-up in the journal Antiquity addressing these questions. Every bone from the grave was labeled BJO 581 in ink. The documentation matched. The DNA came from the left arm bone and left canine. Same person. No evidence of mixed bones from different individuals. The grave had been interpreted as a warrior grave since its excavation in 1878. Nobody contested it until the skeleton proved to be female, and then it was no longer a valid interpretation. That's the bias laid bare. The existence of at least one female warrior buried with full military equipment at a major Viking Age site doesn't mean large numbers of Viking women were warriors. It means at least one was, possibly more. Ella al-Shamahi examining another skeleton from a lavish grave in Asnæs. Norway found a dent on the skull. Forensic analysis confirmed it could have been a slicing impact like a blow from a sword. The bone showed healing, meaning the woman survived. She was buried in a prominent hillside location with arrows, a sword, an axe, and a shield. If these were male skeletons, the presence of weapons and the location and the head wound would immediately be interpreted as evidence of warriors. The assumption would be battle injury. But because the skeletons are female, every alternative explanation gets proposed first. The double standard is clear. The archaeology can't tell us the social meaning of these burials, can't tell us if these women fought regularly or were exceptional individuals, can't tell us their gender identity by modern definitions. But it can tell us that at least some women in Viking Age society were buried with martial equipment and held high status. This complicates the picture further. The question of what Vikings did to wives, given as gifts to allies, requires distinguishing between different categories. High-status women, given in political marriages, were not gifts in the sense of chattel slaves. They were political actors whose marriages created alliances. Their families negotiated bride prices and dowries. The women retained certain rights, but they were also constrained. Their marriages served political purposes. Their fertility was political currency. Their consent was considered, but not always determinative. The sagas suggest completely forced marriages among elites were socially disapproved because they led to instability. But social disapproval isn't the same as women having full autonomy. A woman who couldn't refuse without severe consequences didn't have real choice. For women lower in status, the constraints were more severe. For thrall women and women taken as captives, there was no negotiation. No bride price protecting their interests, no legal rights, no recourse. They were property, used for labor, used sexually, killed when convenient or when ritual demanded. The sources document this repeatedly. The legal codes specify it. The archaeology shows the trauma. The DNA reveals the movement of populations. The system was real. The exploitation was real. The violence was real. A finding from 2021 sheds light on living conditions. Archaeologists examining the teeth of Viking Age skeletons found that nearly 80 individuals showed deep horizontal grooves filed across their upper front teeth. Mostly male skeletons. Some speculated these were marks of a warrior class. But Anna Kellström at Stockholm University noted that 2 men who appeared to be buried as slaves also had these grooves, meaning the practice crossed status boundaries, or meaning that some individuals moved between statuses, or meaning our interpretation of the grooves is wrong. The archaeology raises more questions, provides more nuance, refuses to settle into simple narratives. What can be stated factually is that Viking Age Scandinavia operated a system where women's bodies and fertility served as political and economic resources. High-status women had legal protections and could sometimes leverage their positions to gain power and influence. Lower status, free women had fewer options. Thrall women had none. The sources document systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Document targeting of women in raids. Document concubinage systems where elite men maintained multiple sexual partners of varying legal status. Document human sacrifice of enslaved people, including women. Document domestic violence. Document child neglect in polygynous households. These practices are attested in multiple independent sources from different times and places. The sources also document women's legal rights, document women owning property, document women initiating divorces, document women managing households and businesses, document women's specialized textile production, document women in religious roles as priestesses and seers, document the high status burials of women with symbols of authority, document at least one, possibly more, women buried as warriors with martial equipment. The historical reality contained both exploitation and agency, both oppression and power, both victimization and resistance. The specific mix varied by time, place, class, individual circumstances, and probably by factors the sources don't preserve. The uncomfortable truth is that Viking society simultaneously granted more legal rights to free women than many contemporary societies, while also operating a substantial slave system that exploited both men and women, with female slaves facing sexual exploitation in addition to labor exploitation. Both facts are true. Both appear in sources. Both deserve acknowledgement. Emphasizing only the rights of free women while ignoring thrall women creates a false picture. Emphasizing only the exploitation of enslaved women while ignoring the rights of free women also creates a false picture. The full picture includes both. A runestone from Horning in Jutland preserves a rare voice. Toki Smith raised the stone in memory of Thorgil's Gudmunder's son, who gave him gold and freedom. Toki was a craftsman who gained his freedom. His gratitude was such that he commemorated his former master in stone. Was Thorgil's a benevolent owner? Was Toki's gratitude genuine? Was the runestone carved under social pressure? The stone exists. It testifies to one relationship where a slave was freed and apparently felt or was expected to display gratitude. It's one data point. It doesn't invalidate the evidence of abuse and exploitation. It exists alongside it. The attempt to soften Viking reputation or to celebrate Viking culture requires grappling with slavery. The thing about studying slavery in captivity is that these groups are often described in the archaeological literature as invisible or unseen. Their movements are curtailed. They're denied possessions. They're not always accorded formal habitation, places to sleep, places to live. They're really hard to identify in the archaeological record. That's Ben Raffield speaking to the History Channel. The invisibility is structural, built into the system. Slaves owned nothing, so they left nothing. When they appear in the archaeological record, it's usually as bodies showing trauma, or as references in legal codes and chronicles, or as genetic signatures showing where populations moved. The silence in the archaeological record doesn't mean slavery was minor. It means slavery was so systematic that enslaved people weren't worth memorializing. By the 11th century, Viking conversion to Christianity made the slave trade less profitable and eventually unacceptable. The practice apparently continued until at least 1241 MS, as the civil code Codex Holmiensis from that year contained rules regarding slaves. The transition away from slavery was gradual, economic, religious, not driven by sudden moral enlightenment, but by changing circumstances that made slavery less economically rational and socially acceptable within a Christian framework. Even then, the transition took centuries. The legal language referring to slaves in neuter gender rather than masculine gender for free people persisted. The social stratification persisted in different forms. The fundamental logic of some people having power over other people's bodies and lives shifted form but didn't disappear. What the sources show is that in the period from roughly 750 to 1050 CE, Norse and Viking societies engaged in extensive raiding, trading, and settlement across Europe and beyond. They established trade networks connecting Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. They founded settlements from Iceland to Normandy. They integrated into local power structures in Ireland, England, and elsewhere. And throughout this period, they operated a slave system that treated human beings as commodities. Women captured in raids were sold, kept as slaves, forced into concubinage, or given status somewhere in between as friller with limited rights. High-status women were married off to seal political alliances, bearing children who would inherit and continue those alliances. The system worked. It created wealth. It established dynasties. It built trading empires. It also created immense suffering, destroyed families, brutalized individuals, trafficked people across thousands of kilometers, killed slaves in rituals, used women's bodies as political and economic tools. The late reveal comes from recent excavations at Trelleborg in Denmark. Archaeologists discovered a previously unknown mass grave at the Viking ring fortress. Preliminary analysis suggests it dates to the 10th century, contains remains of at least 30 individuals, men, women, children. No grave goods, thrown into a pit. Initial examination shows signs of violence on multiple skeletons. The excavation is ongoing. Full analysis will take years. But the pit at Trelleborg matches the pattern at Sigtuna. Bodies discarded, no ceremony, evidence of violence. These graves are what lies behind the numbers in the chronicles. When the annals of Ulster say a great number of women were carried into captivity, these are the bones of what that meant. Some captives survived, some died. The ones who survived faced lives as slaves, as concubines, as workers, as property. The graves hold the ones who didn't survive long enough to be sold or ransomed or absorbed. Cold earth, mass burial, no names,